Today, we'll be going through our naming, renaming, and commemoration handbook. And if you'll just give me one short minute while I share my screen, we'll get started. If you would like to follow along on the handbook, you can find it at heritagecalgary.ca/naming. Today, we as a society are faced with big questions around the act of naming and consequently naming and potential removal. The questions surrounding naming and renaming are difficult and inevitable, and all circle around an age-old quandary: what is in a name? The topic of naming, renaming, commemoration, and removal have been very topical in Calgary over the last few years, with the renaming of the Reconciliation Bridge a few years ago out of the White Goose Flying Report and those recommendations, the ongoing work to rename James Short Park and Parkade that was brought in July of 2020, which was the catalyst for this handbook, and the most recent renaming of Calgary Board of Education and Calgary Catholic Schools. If you would like to find more information, you can visit heritagecalgary.ca/naming. How did we get here? Heritage Calgary was well suited to undertake this work as a civic partner with a mandate to advise City Council on all matters relating to Calgary's heritage and to promote public awareness and appreciation of our shared heritage. In February of 2021, Heritage Calgary applied to the Council Innovation Fund with a proposal to develop a framework to address naming, renaming, and commemoration in Calgary. The proposal was approved by the Priorities and Finance Committee in February 2021 and by City Council in March 2021. We commenced the project in May of 2021 and completed the project in May of 2022 with the handbook and final report and the recommendations being submitted to the city. As you can see, the process was very thorough, and we engaged with Calgarians over the last year to ensure that we did so with intention. Over 500 Calgarians participated in our process. The project team set out from the beginning to ensure that Indigenous voices were strong in the project's design and activities. This included establishing an Indigenous sharing circle to provide guidance and support to the project work, and ensuring our interviews and small group discussions included a multiplicity of perspectives from Indigenous community members, from artists to activists to the City of Calgary's Indigenous Relations Office, and others who had been involved with NRCR projects. And of course, NRCR stands for Naming, Renaming, Commemoration, and Removal. Engagement phases and methodology included individual interviews, small group discussions, anonymous surveying, and community engagement. In tandem with our engagement, over 70 published works were examined and compared in a substantial literature review. Typical analysis of the engagement led to the development of a set of related but very distinct key categories of importance in an NRCR process. Those categories were tested with community leaders, and our conclusions were validated further. The project deliverables included the NRCR handbook and the overview, and of course, recommendations that have also been made to City Council, and the city is working on implementing those in the next year or so. I'd say one of the key and most likely important aspects of the work that we completed was the principles. These principles and the aspects of the handbook provide the necessary framework for organizations and community groups to successfully move through an NRCR project. The first are the 12 principles, as displayed here, and I will explore in greater detail as well. The principles identify the common principles that NRCR projects encounter and address. Within the handbook, the principles are presented along key ideas and discussion questions to guide NRCR project teams through what might be complex and sometimes emotional discussions. Principle A, involve the community and people for whom the issue is important. Things to consider would be, who does this name or commemoration matter to? Are they involved in your project? What role would they like to play? What role would they like in the project? What role aligns with your project values and goals? Is your project team and process inclusive of all impacted communities? Does your project team reflect the diversity of your community? Who are you leaving out? So that first principle is to making sure that you're involving the community and the people for whom the issue is important. And that could depend on whatever NRCR project you are taking. If this was a certain community group that was geographical in nature, wanting to make sure that you are involving the people that live in your community or in your neighborhood. If you're a cultural group, wanting to involve all those that are involved or might be impacted by a potential NRCR project. Principle B, understand the historical significance and the original intention for the installation or the name. Some things to consider: what did the original commemorators intend to recognize? What was significant about the name or installation at the time? What historical context does it represent and how? If this is a new name or installation, what is the contemporary context of this moment in history? The thing about commemoration is our context will forever change. Something that we commemorate today, in 10, 15, 20 years, the context is likely going to change. And so making sure that we're always considering things in today's context is a really important piece to understand that historical significance and the original intention for the installation. An example would have been the James Short Park. At that time when it was named, he was a prominent lawyer, had been involved with the Calgary Board of Education as a trustee. But as the context changed and we learned more and more about his anti-Chinese views, that is what led to the community asking for the James Short Park and Parkade to be removed and for a name change. Principle C, understand any harm associated with the event or with the individual event or practice. Things to consider: does the name or commemoration recognize a person, event, or practice that is connected with a negative, tragic, or harmful experience? For whom? What is their perspective? Sometimes we mark the dark parts of our history so we can remember and learn, or to mark a loss or a tragedy. If harm occurred in the past related to the name or commemoration, is the recognition respectful and appropriate for the context? Is it teaching something? Is it celebratory of a perspective that does not appropriately acknowledge the harm? Does the commemoration or name continue to cause harm today? Principle D, engage with original namers or installers or their community or descendants when appropriate or possible. Things to consider: who are the names or installers of the commemoration? Are they part of a larger community? If a particular person or group is recognized, who are their descendants? Is it appropriate to engage with them? Why or why not? How will you engage with those families or community members? What do you want to know? As we all know, naming something is a very personal thing. We all have our own names that mean something to us. And so if there's going to be a removal or a potential change of a name, making sure that those original namers or the family that's connected to that person is often a good thing to have those conversations, so they're not blindsided, if and when that name is potentially removed. Principle E, understand the land on which the statue, memorial, or commemoration is being placed, or that the name will relate to. Things to consider is: what Indigenous territory is your project located in? What is the history and contemporary context of the land where the name or commemoration will stand? Is the precise location of land where the name or commemoration will stand sacred, significantly or culturally significant, or otherwise important to one or more First Nations or communities? How do you know? Have you done the research? How will you engage the First Nations or communities related to the site? And I think this is the perfect example of the Indigenous gathering place likely at Fort Calgary, where the land is as symbolic as the gathering place itself, with Mohkinstsis and the Elbow and the Bow Rivers coming together, and that being a gathering place for Indigenous people for millennia. Principle F, think about the physical context of the installation or the naming or potentially renaming opportunity. Things to consider are: what is nearby to the location of your name or community, i.e. the neighborhood, next door, sharing the area or space? What else has happened here? What is the story of that place over time? How is the space or area used today? Is the name or commemoration appropriate for that context? Again, how do you know? Have you done the research? Principle G, identify opportunities for education and awareness. I think that was one of the biggest things that Heritage Calgary and our project partners heard through this process was when something is named, there's no opportunities for education or awareness. People drive across the Calf Rope Bridge and they say, who is that individual? Or, the other bridges named after city commissioners, or Crowchild Trail. Who was Crowchild? What was his significance to the city of Calgary and to the Treaty 7? And so making sure that when places are named or commemorated, that we're able to use that as an education experience as well. And so some of the things to consider are, does the name or commemoration recognize a person, event, or practice that people do not know about but could learn or benefit from? Is the name or commemoration an opportunity to teach or share an idea or story that is important? Is this the best way to tell that story or share that idea? Does the name or commemoration need to be contextualized? Is there a way to add interpretation to tell more of a complete story? And that's where things like storytelling and plaques and interpretation can come in. And finally, does this name or commemoration add to a fuller reflection of the community by sharing the story of an underrepresented cultural group or diverse perspective? And how will this name or commemoration move the community forward in a positive way? Principle H, amplify history, people, and events that have been traditionally undertold or less known. This whole idea that there is so much more to Calgary than just the Northwest Mounted Police of the white settler history that so much of us grew up about, that there's been stories for thousands of years and other people that have come to Calgary and made Calgary home. Things to consider is the name or commemoration a chance to tell an untold story or to better reflect your community? Is there something here to learn from or celebrate that others would benefit from knowing about? Principle I, aligning with the values or principles of the community or organization. This really boils down to, if you're naming a building or naming a park that maybe an organization has fundraised for, does the name or commemoration align with the values of our community or organization today? Why or why not? And again, how do you know? Have you done that research? Have you done a deep dive into that person or organization to, is it appropriate to name something after them? Principle J is, explore the meaning or significance to the current community, and that those pieces to consider are, does the name or commemoration still have meaning to the contemporary community? Is there an opportunity for learning about that meaning? Has the community evolved so that the importance of the name or commemoration is no longer aligned with community priorities? Can that story be told in a way that is more inclusive or appropriate? Would there be a better outcome if it was told in a different place or through a different media that allows for a fuller contextualization than just, say, maybe a plaque could tell? Are there any errors or oversights that need correcting, or language that needs an update? I know in speaking with some folks, they've mentioned that some of the plaques in Rouleauville likely need an updating. Either the French translation was incorrect, or even just giving them a refresh as well, because as times change, we learn more information about people, good and bad, and making sure that is reflected on that interpretation is an important thing to consider. Principle K, consider the meaning and significance acquired or lost over time. Does the name or commemoration mean something different today? Is there an opportunity to tell a more complete story? Has the meaning or significance of the name or commemoration changed in a way that something about its presentation needs to change? Does it need to be interpreted differently, removed, or contextualized? And I think this is a very good example of the renaming of Reconciliation Bridge from Langevin Bridge. Heritage Calgary worked very closely with the Calgary Aboriginal Urban Affairs Committee, Treaty 7 Nations, and the City of Calgary to provide that contextualization for the plaque for Reconciliation Bridge. Not only does it talk about the impact of residential schools on Indigenous people, but it also talks about who Hector Langevin was and the impacts that his actions had on Indigenous people, and why one of our city's first acts of reconciliation was to rename that bridge of Langevin Bridge to Reconciliation Bridge, which was one of the calls to action under the White Goose Flying Report, which is the city's calls to actions coming down from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Principle L, explore if the name or commemoration is honoring the whole person or a single act. Does this name or commemoration relate to a particular person? What is their story? Does the name or commemoration overemphasize part of their story? Was this person an active participant in or responsible for something that caused harm? If so, how does that position or act relate to their life story? Is using a person's name or likeness the best approach, or is there another name or image relevant to the context, event, or work being honored that might be a good idea? And finally, the process. And I think this is probably the most important piece. And I would really encourage you to go and download the handbook, and you'll find basically a walkthrough for each of the pieces in the process. We didn't have enough time to go through, each, with purpose and decision-making, reconciliation, and learning under the project foundation. But as you can see in this 8-step process, there are a number of sub-pieces located within there. And the handbook that's been put together really will guide you through all of this process. It'll guide you through the purpose of your project, the decision making, reconciliation, which needs to be at the forefront of whatever NRCR project you are undertaking. And then what are you trying to learn from this project? Finally, the organization, project management, who's going to be responsible for what? Things as simple as, a budget. Where are our funding sources? Are we going to have interpretation? How is that going to be funded? And what are our shared values? Making sure that if you as an organization are working with, another group, what are your shared values for this project? Making sure that you paper those so that you're able to always go back to those if you ever kind of find yourself off course. Step 3 of gather information, research, community engagement, and documentation. All 3 very important things, especially that research piece. As I had said earlier, we reviewed over 70 pieces of literature from, the Yale and Harvard white papers on naming around Carnegie and some, controversial donors and libraries and schools at some of those big universities. But also, simple things like if you change the name of a street, the impact that is going to have on everyone who lives on that street, maybe a business that's named after that street, and all those implications that come with potentially changing a street name. And that's something that Toronto is currently looking at. Toronto has a number of named streets. Calgary less so, obviously in our communities we do, but in our downtown core, it still largely is a grid street, which is numbered versus named. That community engagement piece. Who are the community that you're going to be engaging? Reaching out to groups that are likely going to be underrepresented when it comes to community engagement and documentation. That goes back to that, making sure that you've dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's in terms of the research that you've done, the community engagement that you've done, but even the decision-making process as well. If you're a community association that's looking to name a park, that would require city council to finalize that name. And so, showing to the city that you've done your engagement is through that documentation piece. Step 4 is communication for action, messaging and media. What are your messages? What are your key messages? Who is the spokesperson going to be for this process? Making sure that everyone is aligned, which goes back to your shared values, so that you're all on the same page. When you're talking about this project in the community, if you're needing to raise money, making sure that your messaging is aligned is an important thing if you're looking for the community to potentially, donate to fund plaques or interpretation or something like that. Connections, bringing everything together. So, right, that's bringing your project management together, all your learnings, your reconciliation, basically everything that you've done from step 1 to step 5, bringing it all together so that you can then start to go, okay, here's what we're going to name it at, or here's the statue we're going to put up, here's the interpretation we're going to go through it, and then crafting the recommendation. And again, that goes back to that there's likely powers that be that will have to approve whatever NRCR project you're looking at, whether it's a statue of a commemoration. I know there's one of Sir Winston Churchill that's going in at McDougall Center, and so obviously the province would have to be involved in that decision making. But I know the Bridgeland Riverside Community Association has been working on names for unnamed green spaces in their community. And so crafting that recommendation to show all the work that they've done is an important piece. And then finally, advocating for your recommendation. Again, it's likely the city, and so going through your city councilor or Calgary Parks or whatever city department is most appropriate for that, is advocating for your recommendation for that commemoration or for that naming or potentially removal to occur. And finally, what I think is, one of those most important steps is the acknowledgement and celebration. Congratulations, you've made it through that process. And marking your success as a community group or as an organization for taking an NRCR project from project foundations all the way through. We also made a number of recommendations to the city. These are items that we are encouraging council to consider in this upcoming budget cycle, but also into the future. I think what we've learned through the NRCR project is that this is not a quick fix. This is not going to be accomplished overnight. This is very deliberate work that is going to take time. We've made recommendations on things like training and learning, protocol and Indigenous cultural literacy, research and records repository and access, policy and interdepartmental processes, reconciliation and action, support and resource implementation, and workshops and heritage work supports. And I would be remiss if I did not thank all of our project team and everyone that was involved in this project. The City of Calgary for their support of this project through the Council Innovation Fund, and the overall support of this project from both previous and this current council. Our NRCR Indigenous Sharing Circle, which was made up of Sheldon Firstrider, who is an elder and a Blackfoot language revival expert, Marina Crane, who's a Tsuut'ina elder, Fred Powderface, a Stoney Nakoda elder, Matt Hilderman, who's a historian with the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, Paulette Fox, who's a Kainai Nation knowledge keeper and our gathering facilitator, the many stakeholders and community members that provided input into this project, and then of course our project team making up Hadley Group, CIPR Communications, and MD Consulting. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any comments or questions that the group might have, but I encourage you to check out the handbook and the final report on our website. The handbook is very thorough and really will take you through the entire process in terms of how to navigate an NRCR project. And it also has, glossaries and key terms, but also references and other resources that you can look to in terms of looking for reconciliation and how to engage with Indigenous people and how to engage with elders and that sort of thing. So Mackenzie, Clarine, I don't know if one of you is going to manage the question and answer, but that's the end of my formal presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. That was very informative. Yeah, so I can handle the questions part in the chat here. We do have a question that just came in, and it's from D, and they're asking, why name any public funded spaces, structures after people living or dead? So why do you do that?
Well, I mean, the whole idea of naming something is to commemorate and celebrate someone and the contributions that they've made. The city just last year recently named 4 parks one after Lois Sibo, who was the founder of Clubs Claris Carousel, excuse me, who was a very integral member of Calgary's LGBTQ plus community, and I think someone very deserving of public recognition. And then also Calgary's first chief medical officer of health, who sounded the alarm when the Spanish flu was making its way through Calgary in 1917 and 1918. So I think there still very much are opportunities and needs to be opportunities for people to be celebrated for their contributions with parks or green spaces being named after them. We've seen libraries being named, and that's a bit different because it's more sponsorship, which of course is an exchange of money for recognition. But in terms of naming spaces and structures, I think there still very much is a place for that in our society. We just have to recognize that that could change into the future as our values as a society change.
Pop them into the chat. Josh, can you maybe speak on any projects that the NRCR project team is working on right now, and anything that's on the agenda to be renamed or
Yeah, so one of our big pieces through this was we were not going to be coming forward with names or potential sites to be renamed. We felt that largely that needed to be community driven. And I know that with the handbook now out there, there are groups starting to have these conversations. I know in our conversations with the city, they're trying to figure out how they can best resource this work moving forward, whether it's making change. Well, it will require changes to the city's naming and sponsorship policy, but what kind of policy changes those will be will take some deliberate thought. And so I think it will likely be a little while until we see some changes being brought forward to the city process in terms of following the principles in the process, while they work through with the Indigenous Relations Office, with their partnerships group, to make sure that this work is being done deliberately and is being done under the process and the principles that were laid out under this work. The city has been working with the Chinatown Reimagined through the Chinatown Cultural Plan and the Chinatown Area Redevelopment Plan, or the ARP, with that group of a name change for James Short Park and Parkade. My understanding is they do have a name in mind, and I believe it's working its way through the city process. And so while they didn't exactly use our process and principles because they were being developed at the same time, they largely followed the principles that we had laid out, even without knowing them. So there's some other community associations. I know the community of Scarborough is looking at some naming work, and so is Bridgeland Riverside. So I think this work is, it is largely being done by community groups, and kind of our role, Heritage Calgary's role, was to really kind of come up with the handbook and then really put it out in the community for the community to use and start to bring, either commemorations or potential removals or renamings forward.
Awesome, thank you. Do you have any, is there any kind of timeline for how long the process takes at all?
The process really is up to the community group or the group that is doing this process. It can be as long or as short, depending on what they are looking at to name or rename. I think a rename or a removal could potentially take a bit longer, just because you have that added complexity of something already being named or commemorated versus something that may be unnamed or does not currently have a name. But it really is up to the group as to how quickly they want to go, with just remembering that that community engagement piece is very important. And I think there's always that argument to be made that rushing engagement is typically not a recommended thing. And so I think taking your time to speak with the community and other interested parties, I think will get you a better end result at the end of your NRCR project.
The end. So NRCR project, who decides on if these applications to rename things or commemorate things, who decides and approves that? So once community has been engaged, after that process has been gone and done with, who decides?
It would depend who the naming authority is. If it's a municipally owned asset or building, it would be council. Council has the ultimate authority when it comes to naming. And I think the city's still working through like their mechanism for how you would trigger a renaming. I know the Calgary Board of Education, through their naming policy, they had a 2-trigger mechanism where a certain number of the community had to sign a petition, or a certain number of students of that school had to sign a petition in order for the board to even consider the name. The city, I think, will work through some of those more finer details. That was not part of our project scope as to, kind of how that would be. But I think, the city would be very open. I believe if community groups came forward and said, we would like to potentially see this name removed, like they did with the James Short Park and Parkade. And especially, if they have followed this process and the principles that we've laid out, whether they're then proposing a new name or just simply removing a name as well.
Awesome, thanks. And where can one see the handbook, the NCRC project handbook?
Yeah, so heritagecalgary.ca/naming. We have both the handbook, our final report, and kind of a 2-pager overview of it there as well, along with some other resources. That we found along the way, the links to the city's White Goose Flying Report, the links to the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that it's kind of a one-stop shop for folks that are interested or wanting to undertake NRCR projects, that there are a number of resources available to them alongside the handbook that can be downloaded from our website